It's time to cook or be cooked in E2M08 Blobercue. This is another boss fight and somehow has even less going for it in terms of the fighting arena than the previous one. The boss basically jerks around like a more hyperactive version of Dr. Proton, but the thing about those fights is they had actual maps behind them instead of just the boss fight itself. The concept of hiding in crevices is the one remotely interesting thing about it. It's basically just chasing the boss around. The Cycloid Emperor in the later Duke 3D had a similarly small map, but at least he had different attacks to compensate for it and feel overall fun to fight. Ultimately, this is a weak boss and an even weaker map. So much more could have been done here had it at least not just been one long hallway. Even the previous boss had a few spiders. It's time to grab some wine for E4M08 The Big Cheese. It's amazing, the final boss is more engaging than the previous ones, and yet I think I actually hated it, consider it the worst of the four. While there may be more to it, it feels like it's done in more of a cheap fashion, like creating heads to constantly chase you and having turrets everywhere. On top of that, the boss can't even be damaged until you lower yourself again due to its head going just above your firing level, which just feels tedious to do. If this is their idea of making a tougher boss, perhaps they shouldn't have bothered. I'd rather just have a complete map leading up to the boss. Instead, it unfortunately leaves on a pretty sour note, despite having a weirdly amusing ending where Duke ponders conquering Earth before coming to his senses. It's time to zoom way into E1M08 Close Encounter. I'll be honest, this map is thoroughly disappointing. It's another boss level map, so it's basically got nothing to it other than a chain link to grab onto. That would be understandable if it was a fun boss, but it kind of wasn't. It somehow manages to be more dull than the Proton fights, just hanging onto a chain waiting for him to loop around. Bait him into dropping down, avoid some bombs, rinse and repeat while firing shots here and there. There's too much waiting for my liking. The ending cutscene is amusing, of course, but it really doesn't excuse the actual map and fight itself being this uninspired and lackluster. Overall, I'd consider this easily the low point of the episode. They really could have come up with something better for a boss. It's time to get dunked in the green in E3M08 Potted Gelatin. It's about as exciting and deep as the previous two boss maps, which is to say it's not really deep or all that exciting in the slightest. The one upside is it's not a wait for the boss to loop around, you get the cool flying vehicle, but it's still just spamming lasers into its face to kill it first. I wouldn't really say there's much in terms of strategy, just holding down the fire button and making the boss the first one to die. I do find it weird that all these boss maps are so shallow when the original Duke Nukem at least bothered to give you full maps prior to facing Proton. Ultimately, it's another shallow boss map, but I'll give it slight credit for being the least annoying with a nice snow mountain aesthetic and snappier fight. It's time to dance diagonally into E3M02 Rigel Slopeside. It's essentially a copy of Hillside scrap for the most part, from the aesthetic and destructible wood blocks to being mostly a straight line in its linearity. While optional areas do exist, they're very small rooms and does little to really encourage exploration in the broader scope of the map, and even has an annoying backtrack at the end. The robot enemy that seems to be new also does little to charm me to the map, as it's more on the annoying charge at you side than anything and is very small in size. It's a shame because I see potential in the mechanic of burning wood and climbing ladders and things like that, but so far the two maps using it are way too minimal. Ultimately, it's still not a terrible map by any means, but I wish it did more to encourage you to really look around and it didn't boil down to just keep heading up until key then backtrack. It's time to rock on an E1M01 Jailhouse Glock. While not what I'd call non-linear, it certainly wastes no time getting you into the thick of it with difficulty. Hands grabbing you from cells, bombs from boxes that blow up faster if you shoot them, and of course guards shooting you. Introduces turrets that can't be destroyed by blaster, but also introduces a limited rocket launcher to destroy them. Rounding it out with a rapid-fire power-up, it's a decent mix of old and new from the original Duke Nukem so far and shows off graphical advancements. It even steers from the jail aesthetic at the end to show Nukem successfully escaped and is on the outside, ready to thwart the alien invasion. I could criticize the map's relative linearity, but I'll just say it's a well-made starter map to introduce you to Nukem's next exciting adventure to save the world. It's time to avoid all the nuts and bolts in E2M05 Hillside Scrap. This actually breaks the recent trend of maps by actually being fairly lame, especially compared to the last three. While there is a deviating path to get some things, including a Nukem letter, for the most part it's a straight line and the gimmick of the map is just burning up wood, which is underwhelming. The concept of freeing blocks to safely traverse hazardous liquid is pretty cool, but that doesn't stop the map from being mostly dull. I wouldn't say there's that much content to the map either. I finished fairly quickly, and even the new gargoyle enemies were quickly dispatched. Ultimately, it's not a terrible map, but the sheer amount of linearity and the feeling of it being too short leave a lot to be desired. It's pretty dull. It's time to headbutt to the beat in E4M06 Drumheads. This is basically the same theme as the one right before it, which is weird to see a reuse so soon, except it feels much more linear. Instead of elevators, it relies on platforming to get around and very much in one direction, doing climbing and conveyor belts. You could say the platforming gives it more of a challenge getting through, but it felt more tedious and a bit annoying than difficult. Doesn't help that you have to backtrack to the beginning to get an access card to pad out the length of the map. Ultimately, despite having the same theme as the previous map, it's nowhere near as engaging to play. It's time for some Vine Blues in E4M04 Jungle of Misery. This map starts out a bit deceitfully, appearing to be much like a regular base map until you go up the elevator and are in the main jungle area. As cool as the theme is, I don't really like how this appears to be more linear than the previous map of this theme. It seems like there's only one way to traverse, which tends to just be alternating left to right and vice versa, with mostly just side areas that are optional. A key and access card are absolutely mandatory, so the paths leading to them, which seem to be on the side and exploratory, become mandatory. When you get down to it, this map is a bit disappointing. I like the theme, but I wish it had more going on than just a trek to the top. It's time to experience the ultimate chills in E3M06 Ice Hearted. It's another Destroy All Satellites map, this one with a nice new aesthetic centered around the icy mountains, so that's a nice change of pace. The downside is it's largely a straight line from left to right, though with some platforms to climb up to get to the satellites and find the access card to get into the exit. While there's Nukem letters, you can find them fairly quickly just by going up the platforming on your way from left to right. It seems the makers are also very much into those bomb-dropping ships because they tend to use them pretty frequently in some of these maps, but I'm not personally a fan. While the snowy aesthetic is nice and it's not completely a straight line, it's pretty much just a trek from left to right and feels more like Retro Mario than something with depth. It's time to get all facial in E1M2 Tunnels of Facelove. Interestingly, this map takes an approach I can almost describe as similar to Hocus Pocus because you have to destroy 4 satellite dishes so they lose Nukem's location. Though there's still an access card to unlock a force field, I have to commend this map for actually being very non-linear and allowing several different kinds of paths as you navigate around. The facehugger spiders and birds aren't my favorite enemies to fight in the world, but they certainly provide a different kind of challenge, so I can see the merit in them. Now, the satellite dishes themselves aren't hard to find, you literally find them along the required path, but the map itself is still very well made. While the aesthetic perhaps isn't as interesting as a Prison Break, it more than makes up for it with superior gameplay. It's time to sticky jump in E2M06 Slime at a Hop. Admittedly, I was expecting this map to be bad, that it would just be a straight line of platforms without any deviation and it'd just be cheap shots. Thankfully, there's at least some room for exploration. There's more optional areas than you'd think just by looking at it at first glance, even if it's just branches like the previous map. That does mean, however, that it leaves something to be desired still, but at least this map feels like it has more to offer in comparison, and the alien aesthetic makes it a lot more visually interesting. The turrets are mildly annoying, but it just means destroying them with rockets becomes more satisfying. Overall, it's a decent map that could certainly be a lot better, but thankfully isn't as bad as I would have dreaded it being. It's time to get way too crispy in E3M01 Well Done Nukem. I'd compare this map's core to Tunnels of Facelove, both with the birds and spiders and having a slightly linear path. Granted, it does have a much more thrilling aesthetic with red-hot caverns and lava everywhere. Funny thing is, despite the key and access card somewhat forcing your hand, I actually got lost a few times at first. Probably the biggest annoyance is some of the birds are positioned where it's hard trying to kill them, which can feel a little bit cheap. Ultimately, it's still a good map and I love the fire aesthetic, but it more steers towards okay than anything I'd say is really special. It's time to get way too soaked in E3M03 Gelled Hydration. This is another pretty good map with some good variety of paths with spiders, slimes, mini dragons, everything you've come to expect. Perhaps the central gimmick of the map is 2 large waterfalls that vertically span the entire thing that help act as landmarks so you know where you're going. The gargoyles still don't pose all that much of a threat, but they seem to be positioned where they can somewhat more easily take you off guard. Suckers and spiders serve as the real threats here since they're positioned in places where they can easily catch you off guard. Ultimately, it's another map that steers on the side of good and has a nice visual aesthetic with great big waterfalls. It's time to link up the munitions in E1M07 Chain Booms. This map's theme is where things start to get a bit spicy, with meat hooks and some even having blood dripping off it, which is certainly escalation for this game. Amusingly, the rockets near the end also just fall over and explode. I wonder if those ones happen to be duds or something, but it can also hurt you. For criticism, it isn't quite as non-linear as maps before it, but that's not to say there isn't still some room to explore, and it interestingly doesn't end with the access card. If nothing else, I find the orange alien tumorish growths to be an interesting aesthetic choice. You can tell it's nearing the end of the first episode. As the penultimate map, it's not quite as good as many before it, but it's still a very competent map, and I consider it more good than bad. It's time to hop on into E2M01, catch a ride! On one hand, it introduces the very cool aircraft ride with a very powerful laser, but it also introduces one very annoying flying enemy. I actually sort of thought I would despise the map since you're on foot and having to deal with them, but it gets significantly more fun with the aircraft. You're still sort of required to inch forward if you don't want to get cheap shotted. This isn't exactly Sonic the Hedgehog, but it's still fun to wield that firepower. The map is basically a straight line, so don't expect too much potential for exploration, other than a few nukes with items like the Nukem ladders. Ultimately, the map isn't that complex, but the ride you get is certainly very fun and leaves an overall positive impression despite its shortcomings. It's time to bullet bounce an E3M04 skipping a Glock. So, just to get it out of the way, the map is super linear minus maybe a couple of slight secrets, and it doesn't even have Nukem ladders. However, despite this and being a fairly short map, I actually kind of had fun with it, due in part to propeller fans and using the flamethrower for propulsion. This is one of those cases where I can actually overlook linearity and shortness because the main gimmick of the map is genuinely enjoyable. This does, however, mean it's not exactly going to rank among the highest, since I still feel it could be a bit more. Still, it's a simple and fun map that doesn't overstay its welcome, and I'd say it's more good than not in spite of its faults. It's time to tame this tiger in E4M07 Declawed. Well, it's mostly another platforming section to the exit, but this time it's the more alien with bloody meat hooks theme, so at least it doesn't feel like it's a direct repeat. One nice thing at least is you can get through it pretty fast, just an access card located directly below the access door, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. There's some opportunity to take your time a bit and get more things like the Nukem ladders, but the place is swarming with spiders and bots, so risk versus reward. It's nice having a map that feels like a good chunk of it is there for exploring rather than being strictly mandatory, even if you don't feel like going for it. For the penultimate map of the game, you could certainly do a lot worse, and the visual theme is always a good one for what the game is going for. It's time for some light roast in E4M03, the other jail meat. This is yet another prison-themed map, and it's actually a pretty good one, sporting optional areas for that delightful old sense of non-linearity. As expected, there's a liberal use of turrets, which heavily encourages the use of your special weapons if you want to actually get rid of them instead of just stun. It's a pretty standard map when you get down to it, just find a key and reach the exit. It's a formula that's more than been tried and tested by this point. Still, what it lacks in originality so much it makes up for in execution, I can always appreciate a map that has plenty of twists and turns. Ultimately, it's a map that isn't going to necessarily thrill you at this point in the game, but it's always good to have a solid, competent map. It's time to calmly debate with the Senate over a backstabbing in E3M05 Rigelian Rome. Starting with what I like about it, the stone pillar look is nice and reminiscent of Rome, if under an apocalyptic sky, which helps to create a moody atmosphere. The invincibility power-up was fun to have to just rip right through the enemies on your way to the access card, which certainly lives up to Duke's power fantasy persona. Now for the downsides. You probably saw this coming, but the map is a touch linear for my liking, albeit with plenty of traversal and some places to poke into. One thing I really didn't appreciate though is that you can get stuck in the right side if you're not careful, which seems like a bit of an oversight. Ultimately, it's a map that looks cool and has a very cool power fantasy sequence, but unfortunately is too straight-lined for my liking and could have done with more optional areas. It's time to hang 10 in E4M1 Shuttle Shutters. So in a unique twist, the map has you spending most of it hanging on bars up high in the sky, and it's instant death if you fall. This does unfortunately mean the map doesn't have too much variety for exploration, though it does at least have an optional area. I wasn't the biggest fan of the turrets everywhere, especially with how hard some of them are to shoot, but at least you can time their fire. Placing some stuff up above where it just falls into the void if you aren't quick enough was also iffy, especially in item boxes. I appreciate that the map does something different to help it feel fresh, but the execution perhaps wasn't done as well as it could have been. It's time to rumble in the jungle in E1M04 Jungle of Pain. Following in the trend of each map being relatively unique in theming, this one follows the theme of a lush jungle of trees covered in vines. It also, funnily enough, introduces a flamethrower weapon in addition to a crystal ball that gives you a ton of points and a hint when you return to the pedestal on the map. It also introduces an interesting little roof enemy that's like the barnacles from Half-Life 2 long before that was a thing. The main gimmick of the map is of course platforming like across vines, and I think it gets the job done well enough on that front. I'd say it's a good map. There's enough exploration that you can go out of your way to find some additional items should you choose to go through, but it's relatively straightforward. It's time to place templated walls in E4M2 Base-O Basic. This is another Find All the Satellites map, which thankfully means there's plenty of room to poke around and explore through. There also seems to be a new enemy type that's more or less an eyeball that floats around. It was quickly disposed of with basically any kind of weapon. I like how the map actually has some continuity with the previous one since you just made it in the ship before it broke the atmosphere. It even has a couple of the same hanging sections, though they're technically optional, that I would guess represent the ship's thrusters. When you get down to it, the map isn't too much original, but what it has is very solid gameplay and a nice sense of exploration. Are you just happy to see me, or is that E1M3 Pocket Rocket Silo? One thing I have to very much give Duke Nukem 2 some credit for is that they seem to make each map so far have relatively unique themes from each other, this one more apocalyptic. At first glance it looks like it's very straight line, but then it has a lot of height variations to give you somewhere to explore, which is very much to my liking. It introduces further enemies, including a Terminator-type robot, a hoppy boy with a big eye, and snakes that try to swallow you whole, interestingly enough. Also reintroduces the rockets from Duke Nukem 1, as well as ships that just straight up drop nukes on you, which is nuts. Ultimately, this is another well put together map, and the apocalypse robot theme makes it more visually interesting on the whole. It's time to go to the factory in E2M03 Slimy Botheads. This is yet another pretty good map centered around platforming, and to my pleasant surprise has pretty massive optional areas. Really, the main area and exit are the only mandatory spots. The areas to the right of start and at the lowest are if you want to find some goodies, including the Nukem letters. It also technically has a new enemy, though it's really just a payload for those weird giant eyeballed robotic hoppers. This is by no means bad, though. There's still plenty of enemy variety among the previously introduced enemies that it never feels repetitive. As a whole, I'd say this is a fine map that, while not having the most interesting visuals, more than makes up for it by its refreshing gameplay. It's time to take down the brain farm in E3M07, enter the Duketrix. The main gimmick of this particular map is that there's a large conveyor belt in the middle of it you have to use to traverse the various areas. On the plus side, it has some optional areas to the sides beyond the strictly mandatory path, and it's certainly a different feeling map to ones before it. Of course, since there's crushers and robots everywhere, that also gives it a very real sense of danger, so it can actually be tricky, more so with flamethrower enemies. My only nitpick is the conveyor belt means if you miss a spot you have to go all the way around again, which can be a little irritating, but it's not exactly a deal breaker. As a whole, it's a fun map that encourages exploration and has a gimmick that I wouldn't overall say is a detriment to the map itself. It's time to get our heads out of E2M2 Gutter Rocket. This map is actually a little bit devious, starting with what looks like a red item box, but it causes the bridge to collapse. That's not the only trick this map has up its sleeve either, as indiscriminately shooting rockets will deprive you of some of the map's better optional goodies like the pedestal and soda packs. There's even one I can only describe as a fly slimer, thankfully only a threat if you jump up into them, unlike the flying enemies from the last map. Other than that, it's a bit of a maze, which thankfully means it has some non-linearity and room for exploration, which I'm all for. It may not reach as high of highs as the vehicular ride, but it's just overall a very well-rounded map, and what it offers manages to not be annoying. It's time to roll them out in E4M05 Barrels O' Duke. Reminiscent of the first game, there's a lot of toxic barrels stacked, and thankfully the larger ones don't blow into ooze when your projectiles touch them. There's also an element that should make you afraid to shoot your guns near the sides, airlocks that will just flat out blow you into space if destroyed. Now thankfully there's a fair bit of non-linearity with the different floors. The mandatory way forward is largely in one floor with the exit up top, simple stuff. Even the good old conveyor belt and crushers bit to lay into you if you're not careful to avoid them or just run past them. Overall, it's a good map, and even if the airlock gimmick isn't the most fun, it was easy enough to avoid accidentally shooting them since I don't spam my shots. Better grab some oil cans because it's E1M5 Rust Buckets O' Fun. Like the previous map, this is more of an exploratory platforming affair, which I love, and it seems to be themed after the girder maps from the original Duke. It also carries over conveyor belts from the first Duke, in addition to pistons to crush you, and even industrial fans for updraft, in addition to a robot spawner. The crystal balls seem to be for guiding you to the access card if these first two are any indication, and the use of lifts actually got me lost for a hot minute. Amusingly, the boxes containing things themselves can be seen being hoisted by the conveyor belt if you want to chase them. Ultimately, it's another fun map with a good amount of challenge and a healthy amount of exploration, not to mention the new stuff it adds. It's time to get wet and sticky in E2M04 Goo Facial. So far, Duke 2 maps have been fairly good about being more non-linear in choice of paths, and this map is thankfully no exception to that. No new enemies or items, but it makes effective use of what you've seen before. Plenty of those mini dragons, spiders, suckers, goop, and the occasional blue guard to round it off. Plenty of ladders, grapples, and platforms give you plenty of opportunities for traversing around, and for the most part the map is optional, just an access card and the exit. It's a pretty good aesthetic too. Vines and moss-covered stone almost seem like a precursor to Duke 3D's alien vines. As a whole, this is yet another enjoyable map, and I've really appreciated that the maps have been more open-ended instead of straight-lined. It's time to rattle Doom's cage in E1M5 Extra Spicy. As you can guess, the theme of this map is molten lava, and there's a lot of the hot stuff all over this map, in addition to a hidden flamethrower. It also introduces a cloak, not only letting you get past the force field, but just making you immortal for a little while for the aforementioned hidden flamethrower, hidden in lava. This is another good map that has plenty of room for exploration, but the additions of this map really help it stand out from the crowd. While you can get the hidden flamethrower without the cloak, it even has a powerful healing item. It certainly helps if you don't want to eat some of it up. I'd say this is overall a very well made map with a pleasing industrial and geothermal aesthetic and more of that good old platforming. It's time for a prison riot in E2M07 Dejail Blue. This is definitely one of the more exploratory maps. Literally, there are just 9 satellite dishes scattered around and you have to destroy them all. It also introduces enemies it calls raptors, but really function far more like wolves and kind of remind me of the ones from Castlevania games more than anything. The access card is actually completely optional just to get all the Nukem letters, which is an interesting touch. The aesthetic almost feels nostalgic too, since it returns you to the first map's prison aesthetic, complete with the green-handed prisoners, some of which try to grab at you. While the Raptor wasn't exactly my favorite enemy to fight, I have to commend this map for actually having a lot of exploration and being probably the most non-linear yet. It's time to once again debrief this Nukem. Duke Nukem 2 is very much a mixed bag. At its best, it feels like a very refined form of the game before it and has some really cool things added to the table. On the other hand, some of the maps are a bit linear for comfort, and the bosses especially are just completely disappointing with how lackluster they are. I do, of course, respect it for what it's added and think it's overall a quite fun platformer, even if I don't feel the maps have always stuck the landing. While the franchise didn't really hit its peak until Duke 3D, this was still a fun intermediate step towards bringing the series in that overall direction. It certainly has a number of visual themes for the maps that I enjoy, from jungles to prisons and even snowy ice mountains for some nice contrast. If you haven't played it yet, I think you should if you want a good idea of where Dukes come from, after you played the first one, of course, for a point of reference.